Welcome back to another Logosians Podcast. We are going back into our apologetics segment, and we have a special treat for you guys today. We actually have our first guest, Dr. Paul Gould, who's the author of Cultural Apologetics. He's also the director of the philosophy program at Palm Beach Atlantic University, and we are so excited to have him here joining us today.
Thanks, guys. It's good to be here with you all.
Yeah, we're super excited. So Paul, kind of get into this. We recently discussed apologetics and kind of started doing that segment within our Logosians podcast, and we also talked about cultural apologetics. And could you go through what that is for us?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll even kind of back up and say how I ended up writing this book because it'll give a little context to that question.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of an interesting or fun story. But so for 16 years, I was a campus minister working with crew and just working with college students and faculty, wrestling with this question: how can the gospel get a fair hearing on the university campus? And that was this question that sort of has animated me for decades, really. And then I kind of made my way into academia and started teaching, and found myself 8 years ago teaching in a seminary. And we were kind of commissioned to launch a new MA in apologetics, and we were developing classes. I'm like, hey, let's teach a class called Cultural Apologetics. And so my idea, so I was assigned the class. And so like any educator, this is, I don't know, 8 years ago, I did what all educators do. I Googled, what is cultural apologetics, and
Yeah,
there's
right.
like nothing. And so I'm like, what does this even mean? I knew that it sounded like important and it had something to do with how does the gospel get a fair hearing, but there was really nothing at all on this topic. There's very few things. So what I did that first year teaching that class was I just gathered 7 books that I was really interested in on the gospel, culture, and apologetics, and read them as a class. We kind of used it as a research seminar. The next year I did the exact same thing, but I swapped out for 7 different books. And then I did it a third year, swapped out for 7 different books. Finally, after about doing it 3 times, I began to sort of land on my own definition. So to your question, in the book, the definition that I kind of landed on, to this question, what is cultural apologetics, is this. It's working to reestablish the Christian voice, the Christian conscience, and the Christian imagination so that the gospel will be seen as true to the way the world is and true to the way the world ought to be. In other words, that part of our job and this is really, I guess I just think this is what apologetics is, right? We call it cultural apologetics, but we all are members of culture. We all make culture. We're shaped by culture. And so part of the idea is that we don't just want to show that Christianity is reasonable. Of course, we need to do that, right? Any cultural apologetic worth its salt has to argue for the reasonableness of Christianity. But the reality is there's all these objections to the faith that are having to do with whether or not it satisfies, whether or not it's good and beautiful. And so we've got to address those options or those issues as well. And so this is my attempt to kind of argue for a more full-orbed view of how we ought to go about making the case for the goodness, truth, and beauty of Christianity. So that's, the backstory and the definition that I landed on.
One of the questions that we had was about philosophy in particular, which I know you have your degree, I believe, from Purdue University but your PhD is from Purdue, correct?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so you start in your book saying that philosophy and Christianity have an image problem, and so, like you said, how do we make, I guess, Christianity more desirable or more palatable? And maybe not necessarily palatable, but what's the image problem as far as like what's the hang up for philosophy and Christianity among non-believers in the world?
Oh, yeah. So good. I was using that as an analogy and maybe doing a little pity party for me as a philosopher, because, I'm just even reminded of recently the 2015 Republican presidential debate where Marco Rubio said, to wild applause, we need more welders than less philosophers. Mm-hmm. And so there's this idea out there that I get, that philosophy offers no this worldly good. And so we are no good. Because the only kind of knowledge that has any sort of currency in our culture today is the kind of knowledge that has some sort of non-cognitive benefit, right? That gives us some sort of technical know-how. And the idea is that, and of course, there's lots of problems with that, right? I mean, I think knowledge is intrinsically valuable. It's invaluable for flourishing. But anyway, there's this kind of idea out there that we offer know this worldly good. And then even in the church, there's kind of a suspicion, like philosophers are those annoying people in like Sunday school class that are kind of like gadflies that ask really annoying questions and things like that. And nobody wants to be a gadfly. And so, we have this kind of image problem, but I've come to realize that. And part of how I realized that is every semester, especially when I taught at this large seminary in Texas that mostly trained future pastors, I would have to spend the first half of a philosophy class doing apologetics for philosophy, like why it matters, why it contributes to flourishing. But then if you look at, the etymology of the word philosophy, as we like to point out, these two Greek words, philo or philein, to love, and Sophia, wisdom. So look, philosophy is the love of wisdom. But actually, in Plato's Republic, it's way more scandalous. If you read Plato's account of the philosopher, like the philosopher was wisdom's lover, like a scandal, like we're moved by wisdom, And then though, if you go to scripture and you read it in Colossians 2:3, we learn that in Christ are hidden all treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And so for me, it's just obvious that there's a super tight connection between philosophy and Christianity. Right? We're seeking wisdom and knowledge for the flourishing of all. And of course, the source of wisdom and knowledge is Christ, in whom all treasures are hidden. So anyway, so just using that as an analogy, like philosophers who get a bad rap, Christianity today is maligned and misunderstood in so many ways. And so I kind of unpack, we've lost our Christian voice because many Christians were just anti-intellectual. We've lost the relevancy of Jesus to our own lives. And of course, the culture doesn't see any relevancy there. So we've lost the Christian voice. More than that, though, weekly, we read of Christians that disqualify themselves from ministry. And of course, we're just as fragmented often as our non-believing neighbors. And so we've lost the ability to exercise our prophetic voice, which is historically what the church is called to do. And so as a result, the Christian conscience has become muted. And then just to that last piece, the Christian imagination, Christians by and large look at the world and describe the world pretty much the same way everyone else does, as mundane, ordinary, everyday. But that's not the way the world is. And so as a result, we've lost this Christian imagination. And so if you kind of tie all those things up, we've got this major problem. Christianity just isn't seen as plausible or desirable or both, because we've lost the Christian voice, Christian conscience, and Christian imagination. So that's the tie-in to the two image problems.
No, I got you. I've always heard that philosophy is the handmaiden to theology.
Right.
Each of us do philosophy. It's just whether or not we're good philosophers or not, I guess.
That's right.
And Dillon, you had a question to kind of go along these lines.
Sure. So moving further along in your book, you talk about the primary problem in our culture being disenchantment, and then you elaborate that the dominant way of thinking is, as you call it, sensate, and the dominant way of living is hedonistic. So my question is, what is disenchantment, and how did we become so disenchanted?
Yeah, good. That's such an important question, or set of questions. So let me tell you what sort of unlocked this concept of the world has become disenchanted. It was actually C.S. Lewis. Surprise, surprise. You guys like Lewis, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
I heard that you kind of like him, maybe, and Tolkien. But anyway, it was so I love Lewis. Sorry, I'm a Lewis guy more than Tolkien, although I like Tolkien too. But
Josh, we'll forgive you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks. Yeah. But read a lot of Lewis, and it was actually his little essay that you guys might know this, but it's not a well-known essay. It's in his a collection of his writings called On Present Concerns, but it was this essay called Talking About Bicycles. And in there, have you guys heard of this essay?
I have.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's super, it just unlocked Lewis to me, I thought, where he talks about, hey, he was using the bicycle as a metaphor, but there's these 4 stages that we go through with pretty much everything. And so he says, and those 4 stages would be as a young child, you come into the world and that bicycle means nothing to you. You're unenchanted, right? And then, imagine as a young kid, if you guys have kids, that moment when they're riding the training wheels, you're pushing them and suddenly the training wheels are off and they're free. And riding that bike is joy and it's effortless and it's fun and it's, happy in the rich sense of the word. And that's the stage for Lewis, the second stage. We're enchanted by the bike. And then, of course, pretty quickly, as it did for me as a high school student who rode his bike everywhere. The bike becomes drudgery, becomes work. You hate riding your bike. It's uncomfortable. And so you enter that third stage, which is disenchantment. And Lewis says that for most of us, we all stay in that third stage, but that we've got to press on toward the fourth stage, which is re-enchantment. And what he meant with respect to that bike is that we would begin to view the bike as gift and enjoy it in creaturely response. And reading that essay by Lewis kind of unlocked Lewis, and it also unlocked this sort of central metaphor, because a lot of people have picked up on this language of culture as disenchanted. And so you get that Lewis in the background, but the way that I'm primarily using the term in the book is an epistemological term. And it's this idea that we no longer perceive the world the way that it actually is. And actually, theologians talk about an idolatrous way of perceiving the world. And it would kind of be this idea, to go back to Lewis, where we don't see the world as gift, as sacred, as holy. Lewis said that in reading George MacDonald Fantastes, that it helped him to understand, the meaning of the word holy. But that's the way the world is, right? And so disenchantment is this idea that we no longer see the world in its proper light. And why does that matter? Because if we don't see the world the way that it actually is, we're not going to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And I don't think we're going to invite others to see and delight in the world the way that Jesus does. And so we've got to press on, as Lewis said, to that fourth stage of re-enchantment.
Right. Yeah. So I think two things that kind of go off of that, as far as how that essay from Lewis kind of unlocks the way that he thinks about things, and maybe the way that we should. The dedication to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, to Lucy Barfield. He starts talking about how he started writing the book for her, and at the time, he didn't realize that girls grow quicker than books, but he hopes that one day she'll dust it back off and get back into it. So it's this whole idea of becoming re-enchanted and getting back into fairy tales, and ultimately looking back on reality through that. And then the other thing I think is he dwells on this a lot with writing in the discarded image and getting into the way that the medievals looked at the world. That's something that we've lost.
That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And even, you were talking about how we look at the world as mundane now. I thought about that, and I started looking up the etymology of the word mundane, and it derives, go back from Latin, the word mundus, which would be essentially like cosmos in Greek. So it would just mean everything, the whole world. And somehow we've slowly devolved into that just meaning boring worldly stuff.
Right. And it's a flat, it's a flat concept right now, right? There's no structure, there's no hierarchy, there's no scale of being, right? There's this discarded image, like you said, where it was just this rich world, this, the great chain of being that the medievals held. All those things have been flattened to just the little BBs, the corpuscles, the particles in the void, and that we're nothing but particles in the void and things like that. It's a very disenchanted way of understanding the cosmos. So yeah, that's interesting. It's a good connection.
So in your book, you discuss 4 characteristics of disenchantment. Can you explain to us what you mean by those? What are those 4? What do they mean? And how can we become re-enchanted?
Good. Yeah. Okay. So, 4 characteristics. The felt absence of God, number 1. Number 2, the commoditization of everything, which I can explain. There's a connection between those two. A kind of foolishness run amok, number 3. And then number 4, just rampant and pervasive idolatry. So these are kind of the characteristics of a disenchanted age. And by the way, even the phrase disenchantment was coined by Max Weber, who's a sociologist, and then it was picked up by some philosophers, Charles Taylor being one of the more important ones, and to really talk about this secular age as a disenchanted age. And so the felt absence of God, just kind of just this idea that we no longer think that God is fully present. We have this idea that we exist on this world, and it's not populated by deity. It's just mundane, and to use that flat term again, and the heavens are empty. And right on the heels of that, though, the felt absence of God, which, by the way, infects not just the world out there. I think our churches are largely, our Christian experience of God is largely the felt absence of God. And that's partly on us in the way that we think about Scripture and think about the world. And we're disenchanted as well. And then on the heels of the felt absence of God, though, comes that second characteristic, the commoditization of everything. So what you have is a kind of emptying of the world of its value, of its sacredness. And so, even in the book, and since you guys are Lewis fans, just that scene in The Magician's Nephew with Uncle Andrew and the two kids. Yeah. And like how Uncle Andrew couldn't see anything of beauty in the creation of Narnia, right? The only thing he saw was the potential financial value of that lamppost, right?
Yeah.
That has great monetary value,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's the commoditization of everything. And so what happens is people and things are reduced to their monetary value. And that's very, very scary. From that, you have a kind of foolishness and just foolishness run amok. And case in point, just look at your news feed on your social media.
Mm-hmm.
And then a kind of idolatry. Of course, we all struggle with idolatry. That's nothing new. Calvin says that our hearts are idol factories. We're constantly struggling with that. But in a disenchanted world, it just becomes more pervasive and more entrenched, where the idolatry is just everywhere. And so how do we re-enchant? And so the second part of your question, how do we re-enchant ourselves? Well, that's a longer tale, but in the book, and I'll pause, we can explain these or not, but in the book, I offer two possible steps. One is that we join with God and each other and the Holy Spirit to awaken desire. And then secondly, we return to reality. And what I mean by returning to reality is two things, super important. Number one, we begin to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And number two, we begin to invite others to do the same. So I can say a lot more about that, but that's the quick answer to your question.
Right.
Yeah, and I know I didn't send this, or we didn't talk about this earlier, but one of the problems that we see in the church a lot is like apathy in men. Do you think that part of that is because of the disenchantment that men have, or if you had to talk to men directly, what would you think would be a good strategy for getting them being fully involved with the church? Because guys that we know, they're like, man, I feel closer to God when I go fishing or hunting or do stuff outdoors. So
Right,
they get, so there's something in them wants the beauty, and they feel that whenever they're out in nature.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation. And of course we should feel that out in nature. And I think what we need to do though is trace that to its source, but I think that that's actually a great place to start. Unfortunately, it's kind of weird. Your comment that men feel closer to God in nature than they do in church, maybe, I think that was part of your comment.
Yeah.
And that is kind of an unfortunate reality. And so there's some real questions about why that is. And maybe we have a weak theology of church, ecclesiology, a weak theology of what it means to be embodied humans in the church as worshipers. I think that one of the predominant trends that we see in culture because of disenchantment is the rise of one of the 7 deadly sins, the one that was historically called sloth. But more popularly, we might understand it as a kind of apathy towards the things of God. And this is actually this was one of the 7 deadly sins, right? Kind of a big deal. And what it was a disordered love. And so where we're not rightly ordered in terms of our soul. And so somewhere between that disconnect between sensing God's presence in nature, which is a good thing, and missing it in church, there's a disconnect on what it means, the importance of church, the importance of discipleship, how liturgy actually matters, and a whole host of things that probably are relevant to your question. That's a good question.
Well, one thing that I was really curious about, Dr. Gould, is what are some of the most, in your opinion, because I know that obviously, because of the subject matter we're talking about, we're obviously like spirits in a lot of ways. We've already referenced Lewis a number of times. What are some of the most impactful books that you've ever read that really helped you get a hold on this idea of disenchantment and what it means to be re-enchanted? So I guess a short way to ask it is what are some of the books that really re-enchanted you?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is interesting since you guys all are fans of Lewis and Tolkien. It really is Lewis and Tolkien, more Lewis for me, and all of his works, his fiction, the Ransom trilogy, which I'm getting ready to teach next semester, which is super excited about that.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So I would say Lewis in general, and then what is so interesting about Lewis though, is that he's a classic scholar. He was a student of the classics. And part of what I've been able to do the last couple of decades is teach the classics as a professor. And so I've been immersed in the Greeks and the Romans and reading Homer and reading Plato and reading Aristotle and reading Augustine and Boethius. And what you find in Aquinas and Anselm, and what you find is that Lewis is so penetrating because he's interacting with the greats of a more enchanted age.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's also translating that. And so I would say, if not Lewis, Augustine, and maybe Boethius secondarily, but probably Augustine's Confessions and Lewis, the corpus of Lewis, are the most impactful in my own journey. Yeah, and then lots of good fiction, but those are the best. So
Yeah, I think it's interesting that this disenchanted age that we're in coincides with this loss of studying the classics and things like that.
Yeah,
that these were
right.
things that that Lewis and Tolkien, for example, their imaginations were baptized because they grew up in this like older world that we've lost.
Yeah, and what's so interesting, like, I love Homer's Odyssey, and you see so many connections to the gospel in Homer's
Mm-hmm.
Odyssey, I think, and just the longing for home and all these things. But the experience of the ancients, this is what struck me though, and this is why Lewis and Tolkien are so good at what they do, like, because they're writing, but they even though they lived in our age, they hail from a different age, I think, in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
But the ancient experience of the world was so vastly different than our experience of the world, and it was not uncommon to think that you would walk behind a tree and you'd be met by a god, right? In the ancient experience of the world. Now, obviously, we don't believe in tree gods now, and Lewis would say, as he did, that those things must go, but we threw out everything with it. And Lewis did a great job, I think, of helping us see the way that the world does. And actually, two things. Writing this book, I wrote this book wrestling with this question: how does the gospel get a hearing? But what was so surprising is the book has been so impactful in my own life and in many people for discipleship, for our own growth. That was the first thing that was interesting. The second thing, I made this claim that we need to return to reality, and the idea was that we need to begin to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And so that's actually forced me back to the Gospels and to ask that question, well, wait a minute, how does Jesus see the world? And what is the biblical view of the world? And what you see, Jesus views the world vastly different than a contemporary modern, secular person. And so, it just helped me to even go back to scriptures with a fresh vigor to really answer these questions for myself in my own devotional reading and my walk with God.
Yeah, speaking of that, are you familiar with the Bible Project?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's something that I've been thinking about a lot. Is he talks a lot about how the way that the ancient Hebrews would have seen the world and how much different it is than us.
Right.
And so they kind of reinforce that when they're reading the Bible and saying this is what they would have been thinking about when they read this. It's something that doesn't occur to us in modern times.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, one of the questions that we had, like, as far as the apologetic goes, is there a sequence to using apologetics, or it seems that cultural apologetics has to precede the traditional view of apologetics. So, do you have like a strategy or a step-by-step process that you kind of go through for your apologetic?
That's good. Yeah, in the book, I kind of carve out cultural apologetics like as its own lane, and then maybe distinguish it from what you might call rational apologetics or moral apologetics or imaginative apologetics. I think mine encompasses all those, so I win. No, just joking. In terms of method, like, it's actually the idea was that, hey, we've got all these resources at our disposal, and we've only walked this plank of reason, like, which is a well walked, and we ought to walk that plank of traditional apologetics, right? The arguments, the evidence. Like, we walk that plank as we build bridges from our Athens to Jesus and the gospel. But there's all these other planks in our bridge building that we should lay down, right? The plank of conscience and the plank of the imagination. All of these are at our tools in our toolbox. So I'm happy to be a pluralist in the sense that we build bridges. So the motto would be like Paul and Mars Hill. And this is, you have Paul engaging a culture unlike his own, and you see him do like three things apart from understanding the culture, which was the first thing he did. But in his speech there, he affirms what he can affirm in the Athenian culture, and he identifies his starting point. For him, it was all these idols to the unknown God. And then from there, he builds a bridge to Jesus and the gospel, and he does it brilliantly by, number one, affirming what he can affirm, the religious impulse behind that idolatry in this worship of this unknown God. but then he outflanks their thinking in a brilliant way. And if you just walk through how he builds his case, he outflanks their thinking, quoting from the poets and the philosophers of their day effortlessly, agreeing with them to a point, but reinvesting them with new meaning. And then he confronts their rank idolatry. And I think that's a good model for us, so that means we need to do so the call or the charge, really, I think this is just apologetics, but we'll call it the charge of the cultural apologists, is that we need to do two things. We need to be students of culture, students of theology, and then make connections, between the two as we do our case making. And of course, we're going to walk that I'm a philosopher. I love arguments for God, right? I traffic in propositions. So this is challenging to me, right? There's all these other things that we need to incorporate into our apologetic than just the traditional. And again, I wouldn't say, so I don't think it's more like that this is I think even in our case making on the rational stuff, we do that with imagination always in view, right? So it's more like we're reconceiving the whole project, as opposed to this comes before, we give them the Kalam cosmological argument or something. Sure. No, let's do that. Absolutely, let's do that. But let's do that with the imagination in mind as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I think that like the Kalam and a lot of the other arguments like that serve their purpose. There may be 10-15% of people this is what they need. They need this these type of arguments. But the most effective one has always been the moral argument, or something on emotion or beauty, where people have come to find Christianity attractive, and that's why they've been pulled to it.
Well, and I'll just expand off of that and say that one of the beautiful things about this is there are so many of these lanes, as you called them, Dr. Gould, that there's a lane for everybody. Everybody can be met where they are. I'm one of those people who it was the imagination side that got me. Like we talked about in the first podcast episode. I met Jesus after having a framework of Aslan and then all of the characters in Tolkien and these great myths. And that's what's beautiful about it, is that cultural apologetics is right there and right in the face of people who need that, and that's what the best way that's going to bring them into the kingdom. But then there is also traditional apologetics. It seems like at the end of the day, it comes down to an individual case by case, and we just need to do the best we can to be prepared as we can in any one of those situations.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it requires wisdom, requires us being prepared to be, as Peter says in 1 Peter 3:15, to give the reason for the hope within. It's just a much broader. The reasons that we have are intellectual, they're emotional, they're moral, they're imaginative, they're narrative. All those things are at our disposal, because that's the kind of beings that we are. And so, yeah, good.
Yeah, Josh, what did you call that? You said y'all were baptized in the imagination, or
so this is a Chestertonian term. He talks about having the the baptism of the imagination. Lewis talks about it a great deal in his work, but really after what we said, we pretty much can see he gleaned that idea from
Chesterton. I'm pretty sure
in many ways. But basically, that your imagination beforehand was basically made ready for the message of the gospel and something like that.
Kind of connected with this, Dr. Craig, William Lane Craig, talks about whenever he's doing his why talk about apologetics discussions, and he says that there will always be someone that comes up to him and says most people don't come to the faith through argument, and he will say something like, well, think about C.S. Lewis. You got to him through this, and then he got to everybody else through his method. Yeah. So Dr. Craig may not agree about the term cultural apologetics or whatever, but that's kind of where he's going with that, is that there's a piece for everybody, and then you connect it to you get C.S. Lewis, and then he writes all this imaginative fiction, and we get to this cultural apologetic framework that we have.
And we get to make a podcast about it.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's right. Make new culture. Yeah. Good.
Dillon, me?
You go ahead.
So I guess a little bit different, but talking about culture. So with all the hypersexuality, the violence, and all these things approaching justice and stuff, how do you move from dialogue about apologetics without violating our own convictions or muting your compassion, remembering that the person is is made in the image of God and they deserve respect. Like, how do you move from dialogue, even without compromising what you believe?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it gets to the complexity of our culture. I was just looking in my book before we got on, because I haven't looked at it in a while, and I was talking about this Tim Muehlhoff, who's a friend of mine, teaches at Biola, is a communication professor, and he talks about how there's this sort of adversarial frame of mind in culture right now, which is so true, and it's just been the volume on that has been turned up since Tim wrote those words himself, and so it requires wisdom. But even if you think of like what we talked about earlier with Paul at Mars Hill, where he first affirms what he can affirm, and then he outflanks their thinking, and then he confronts their rank idolatry, which is a kind of good framework, I think, to engage. But notice that each of those actions there's a corresponding virtue, I think, that is required. Like there's a kind of wisdom, to affirm what we can affirm in a way, and a kind of charity there, and maybe even temperance and justice. But then as we outflank their thinking, of course, there's this intellectual virtue that's required, that we're really students of culture, students of theology, and we're making those connections, which requires a lot. That's why that we've got to reject this rampant anti-intellectualism in the church. Mm-hmm. And then like the confronting of rank idolatry, like that takes courage. And again, it takes wisdom to do that in such a way that's like Paul did it at the right time. He didn't do that on the front end. If you notice in his speech to the Athenians, he only confronts them with rank idolatry when he's the first part of that speech was all within the Greek mindset. It was only when he began to speak about Jesus that he moved the discussion into a distinctly Judeo-Christian mindset, and then confronted them. And he did that gently, actually, by just helping them to understand that this God whom they worship is unknown, who healed the plague. That was the God that they were worshiping, this unknown God that mysteriously healed the plague from 500 years ago, who's their creator and sustainer and ordainer. This God whom you worship is unknown. He begins to introduce to the Greeks this concept of moral accountability to a personal God. And that was something that was really fuzzy in the Greek mindset at the time. And then he challenges them to repent, to literally change their mind. And he does that by bringing them to this question: what do you make of Jesus Christ? And this claim that he proved that he was God by raising from the dead. And so there's a real logic to how he does that I think we would be mindful of to borrow. Where we're not just forcing our Christian convictions at the front end, right? But that we're building that case so that they can actually have ears to hear, and sort of diffuse that adversarial mindset that much of our culture is their starting point. So yeah, wisdom, I think, is the chief virtue, and courage, and all the others.
That was the first time, just when he was discussing that I kind of made the connection between this idea of re-enchantment and actually the biblical idea of metanoia. Right, it's like the two are kind of intimately connected in ways.
That's good. Yeah.
If as a professor, if you had one question or apologetic question that you could answer for college age students and stuff, whatever, what would that be?
Oh man, that's a great question. That's a hard question, I should say, because we're all different, and we all have our own individual stories and our own individual issues with the gospel and whatever our individual wounds. But I guess if I could boil it down to one, the ultimate question that we want every person on the face of the earth to ask and answer in a way that they can understand is, what do you make of Jesus Christ? So I guess the way that I would want them to think about life is just to consider the possibility that Jesus is better than you think, right? Whatever they've been told, whatever they've heard from culture or seen in Christians, right? Because we're hypocrites as much as anyone. Of course, the Bible ensures that we'll be hypocrites because we're sinful. We get that, all that. But just consider the possibility that Jesus is actually better than you think, and that he's actually the thing that your heart most deeply longs for. And so I guess if there was one thing, I would just want them to see and understand who Jesus is. And one other way that I've framed this is, of all the competing stories out there, this is what Tim Keller did so well. He would say, of all the competing stories that are out there, is there one that understands you? And the claim is that there is a story that's alive and that understands you, and that's the Christian story. And because in that story, you get Jesus, the lover of our souls and things like that. So that would be the one thing. Of course, the second question, there would be many things to get to that one thing, but that'd probably be the one thing.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess that kind of talks about how, in your book you talk about how Christianity is actually good for the world, and there's a lot of folks in our culture that would say or would try to disagree with that. And I know that we have some folks, whether it's guys like Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland, that are kind of bucking that way of thinking. But what do you mean that Christianity is actually good for the world?
Yeah, good. Yeah, you're right. Because so with the new atheists, which are a bunch of, there's like the so-called four horsemen. You guys know this, I'm sure, but the four horsemen of the new atheists about a decade and a half ago, guys like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and
Daniel Dennett.
Daniel Dennett, thanks, the philosopher. Yeah, these are basically the standard line that they're giving. They wrote these New York Times best-selling books, and except for Dennett, a lot of their arguments were recycled 19th century atheist arguments that were really bad, But what was different was their rhetoric. And their rhetoric, if you could just focus on like a Dawkins, is that Christianity is dangerous, it's destructive, and it's delusional. Like it's really bad for the world. It's dangerous because it causes religious people to fly planes into buildings and kill thousands of people. It's destructive because it wrecks our lives, and it's a form of child abuse, and it's delusional because it's something that you're told to believe apart from evidence. And so I felt like it was important in the book to talk about the other narrative, that it actually is good for the world because of the new atheists and this kind of, even in teaching philosophy, when I was a grad student at Purdue, about the time of the new atheist movement that was sort of prevalent, I taught undergrad philosophy, and we'd get to the question of God, and we'd spend a good bit of time on the arguments for and against God. But there were a number of students that would be parroting Dawkins and Hitchens and these guys, just that God is a moral monster, and all these things. And so I think
if they were parroting Hitchens, I'm sure they would just be with less charm and less funny.
Exactly, with much less, maybe more Dawkins, right? Because without any charm, with really bad arguments. Because as a professional philosopher, I read that book, and I read the chapter on the God hypothesis or whatever, and it was like embarrassing. These are not good arguments, but yet this is the cultural currency that was relevant. So when I say that Christianity is good for the world, it's good for the world for at least two reasons. Number one, because when you get Christianity, you get Jesus. When you get Jesus, you get everything. Number two, it's true, and being rightly related to reality is a good. But beyond that, it's good for the world in all these like physical ways, and this is what I kind of highlighted in the book, like historically, hospitals and meeting the needs of the poor, and libraries and all these things are that were developed because of a Christian worldview and Christians. And so it's literally good for the world in that sense too. So not just like heavenly good, but like it's good for the physical needs, making the world a better place because we care about flourishing, and that's of course spiritual and physical.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think this kind of is something that we talked about. Charlie and I taught a class at our church about Christianity and other worldviews, and we not just developed, what the worldviews actually were and what their differences from Christianity, but we also kind of dwelled on, okay, what have been the effects of that? We talk about modernism and like the French Revolution, and then we get into more specifics about like Marxism and the what's the word I'm looking for?
We did critical
Soviets
theory.
and then critical theory.
Yeah, just all the mass murders. Yeah.
And just like what are the results of this worldview and holding it, and then we go back to Christianity and like, well, you get hospitals and caring for the poor and all these
universities,
the elimination of infanticide as like a normal part of culture and stuff like that.
Basic human rights. Women are actually looked as equals as men, because they're made in the image of God. They have immeasurable worth, and whereas in first century Judaism, they didn't even count for much of anything.
Yeah, and ancient Romans just kind of gave their daughters a female version of the dad's name and stuff.
Yeah.
Or even just look at what's going on in Afghanistan right now, and just the horrific conditions of women that are fleeing and fearful for their lives and their conditions. With a different theistic view there, this sort of radical Islamic view that, and so you're right. Christianity is super important, and it's important to point out that it actually is good, and Dawkins is completely wrong, in these ways. And so, I'm glad you guys did that. It's a good question.
Oh, and I was just going to say all of the reasons that we just pointed out that Christianity is physically good for the world. These are exactly all the things that right now we see in our, as Dr. Gould mentioned earlier, in our social media feeds and on mainstream media. These things are, I feel like, very intentionally being muted, or the credit that is due of the Judeo-Christian ethic is being taken away from it or withheld from it. So it's interesting to see that the popular message is that it is actually the Judeo-Christian ethic that is the backwards one, when really it is at the cornerstone of all of the liberties and freedoms that define the Western world.
Yeah, and this is actually another, what you brought up is another consequence of disenchantment, is that we become, as Lewis would talk about chronological snobbery, like we no longer, I mean, we're rewriting the narrative of the past in so many ways. And of course, the Christian narrative is being rewritten too. And without the Christian conscience shaping culture like it used to, we're no longer largely informed. We're no longer biblically literate and all these things. Everything's changing at a rapid pace. And that's partly because of this lack of a memory of there's a way that the world ought to be that was, everybody pretty much held if you go back 500 years. And so, yeah. Lots are changing because of this disenchanted world we find ourselves in.
And Dr. Gould, do you think that because we've have gone away from these other things, so since we're so disenchanted, do you think that the reason why we see so many of these different types of maybe weird ways of thinking breaking out, you think that's because maybe that our souls are wanting, our spirits are wanting to be enchanted, and so they just kind of just get out any way they can, and we end up having all these weird other things? Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah, that's good. I do think, yeah, there's we have what the intelligentsia are telling us. There is no world beyond this. There's nothing beyond this world. There's nothing transcendent. There's no way that things ought to be. Right? This is what we're told. But then our longings betray us. I talked about this in the book. There's this interesting, if we pay attention to our longings, we're fascinated with things beyond this world, right? Whether it's in 2016 being captured for 15 minutes in summer with these little, Japanese mythical creatures called Pokemon Go and walking around with this augmented reality, something beyond this world, right? That's a kind of that betrays, I think, the deep longing of the human heart for something more, right? And this is what I love about Lewis and the argument from desire. We long for more. Yeah. The problem is, without a way the world is, because the world has been stripped of her structure, her scale, her essences, her natures, all the stuff, the richness of the world. Without a way the world is, anything goes, right? And that's why you're seeing all these, within 3 to 5 years, norms changing with respect to sexual identity and gender and all these things in a rapid pace, because there's no grain to the universe anymore, we're told. And so there's no reason to live according to that grain, because we're just making it up as we go. And so that's that's a real consequence of a disenchanted world that's flattened. This discarded image, for example, that Lewis talks about. With that gone, it becomes really hard to not just do whatever you want to do. So anyway, yeah.
Dillon, did you have it? Another one? Or
oh, sure. How do we audit your class on the Ransom trilogy?
On what?
On the Ransom trilogy.
Yeah. Come. Here at Palm Beach Atlantic University, they brought me here. We moved here a year ago. We were talking earlier. Down here in South Florida, Palm Beach, we have a new master's in philosophy of religion, but really all it is cultural apologetics, with the volume turned way up, right? Because we're going really deep into philosophy. So yeah, come join. Come take our program if you're interested in this stuff. It's everything that you would want in a philosophy MA degree. You got metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, logic, philosophy of mind, philosophy of science. But then we have what we think is unique to this program is we're calling it public-facing philosophy, just cultural apologetics on large, where we have a class on public philosophy. We have a class on philosophy and literature. That's the class I'm gonna get back into some Lewis in the Ransom trilogy. We have a class on philosophy and tech. But all of them, the whole thing is we're basically taking students to the trunk of philosophy, and then they can play on any of the branches, right? If they're interested in
Yeah.
apologetics or literature or art. We've got film students, we've got actually college professors, we've got pastors and parachurch people, we've got people that want to do PhDs in philosophy, artists, all of them, but they need the core, right? They need the trunk,
Yeah.
and that's what we're doing. And so, yeah, so come to the program or just,
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
take the one class. You can take it over Zoom, actually, because we have hybrid options. And so we've got folks that don't move to West Palm, but we do it over Zoom on Monday night for the semester. So yeah, just
I'm seriously
find me on
considering that.
email. Yeah.
It's interesting that I've noticed that these things have been popping up like this, and then like Houston Baptist, they have a master's in apologetics, and they have like an emphasis in more traditional, and then the emphasis in cultural that has like Dr. Michael Ward is a part of it and stuff like that. And I've noticed all these things over the last couple of years have just been popping up, I guess through God's coincidences or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's I think it's good. Like I think that we need to continue to do all the rational apologetics, but there's so much more that we need to explore because we're like embodied human beings, right? We're creatures that have bodies, and we have all these longings. And the way that I parse it in my book, the three, using Paul as our model, like the starting points I identify are the universal longings for goodness, truth, and beauty, and those correspond to these bridge planks of reason, the conscience, and the imagination, which are these sort of God-given faculties that are on a quest for the object of their longing. Reason on a quest for truth, goodness on the conscience on a quest for goodness, and the imagination on a quest for beauty. And all of that, Peter Crate has this great little chart in one of his books where he basically says, what's the source of goodness, truth, and beauty? And the answer is Christ, right? If we put our theology caps on. I love how Augustine put it. He said in book 3 of the Confessions, this is why I love Augustine, he said, of God, you are the beauty of all beautiful things. And then he says, you are the good of all good things. And I would just add the truth in which all true things point. And so that's what apologetics should be, all of that, because that's how God has made us, right? We've been made to be nourished on the good and the true and the beautiful. And so why would we limit it to one when we're called to be nourished on all, we're created to be nourished on all of them? So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox, but
no, you're good.
There you go.
Yeah, you're in the nest. You can go as long as you want. It's fine.
Yeah.
One of the things that Cultural Apologetics kind of brings it to mind, because of all the culture, the shift, how fast everything's changing. I know all of us have young kids, and so like we're homeschooling. So at what point, I know Rob Dreher talks about the Benedict option, and then he has a book, Live Not by Lies. What's some advice you could give to Christians that are considering seriously the Benedict option that Rob Dreher kind of puts forth?
Yeah, I have not read his second book. I read the Benedict option and actually interacted with it in my book. I think just to kind of, I think my idea is that the Benedict option is a great model for how we ought to be the church, but it's not a great model for how we ought to engage with culture. That's kind of although I think actually his Benedict option is consistent with my overall sort of proposal. Like that is one way you could take this idea of cultural apologetics, but I don't think it's the best for this reason. I don't think it's informed by the best theory of what culture is and how culture changes and how we ought to be engaged in culture. And the reason why I say that is I'm persuaded by the sociologist James Davidson Hunter. He wrote a book called To Change the World in 2010 with Oxford University Press, which I think is probably the most important book that Christians ought to be reading on culture and how culture changes and how we shape culture. That and probably Andy Crouch's book, Culture Making. And the reason why I don't think the Benedict option is the best option for how we ought to relate to culture is because Hunter's point was that culture always changes from the top down, never from the bottom up. And what he means by that is we need to be populated in the culture-shaping institutions. We can be on the periphery of it, but we need to be in the culture-shaping institutions because that's how culture is formed. So we need to be in the key culture-shaping institution with respect to truth, which is the university, and with respect to the beauty, which is the arts, and with respect to good, which is like the city. That's a whole bunch of things: politics, law, government. If we pull out of those and just do parallel institutions, we're actually going to lose the key culture-shaping institutions. And if we lose those are the ones that tell us what reality. Those are the people in those institutions get to tell us the truth about reality and the truth about goodness and the truth about beauty. And so if we just do parallel institutions, we're going to lose our voice. And so that's why I wouldn't go Benedict option with how we ought to, because I don't think the gospel's ever going to get a fair hearing if we just wait it out in our arc. So anyway, all that to say, I loved it for like all the practical, this is what the church should be like, but that's why I would not want to go Benedict option all the way. Because then in 20, 30 years when we surface, the culture has already passed us on.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, you kind of see a little bit of that now, right? Because Christians for so long have just not gotten in. I'm not saying there's no Christians in politics, but
that's right.
It's
Good.
looked down upon a lot of times for someone who is a Christian to get into politics, because everyone's like, oh, you're just going to get ruined. You need to go, if you love Christ, then you need to be a pastor, or you need to do these other things, but don't get into politics. And
that's right.
And so now we are seeing a little bit of where good men didn't go in there to maybe fight for the reality. And now we're seeing some effects of that.
Totally. And like, if we believe that laws contribute to flourishing or disflourishing, well, then we should care about laws, and therefore we need to care about politics, right? And you could do this for everything. If we care about who gets to narrate the stories of the world, well, we should care about Hollywood, because right now they're narrating the stories of the world. And so we should be there producing and making culture. And you could do this for the university too. Like if we're not represented in the university, especially how are we ever going to get taken seriously if we're not members? At least some of us, are called to the academy in that way. And so anyway, yeah, you're right. I don't want to come down hard on the Benedict option. I think it's a super important book, but I'm not convinced that's the best way forward for us. So
yeah, no, I agree with you on that. I think that we just need to do a better job of making culture warriors with our children as they grow up.
Yeah.
That's the long game. Reinforcing the family and following Christ and proper theology and apologetics and all that. That's what we need to be focused on.
Yeah. I will say, can I add? It's interesting. You write this book, and then you realize a year later a couple big misses that things like, oh, I totally should have talked about that. Here's one big miss. It's related to your question, and it's related to the Benedict option. So I came to faith through like a parachurch ministry, so like a campus crew. Basically, I came to church, and so most of my Christian life was as a campus minister, where we're a member of a church, but I just I don't have a rich theology of the church. And so I wrote this book, and then I realized about a year later, like I was actually reading in my devotional time Ephesians 3:10, and 11, where Paul says it was, God's intent was, to reveal his manifold wisdom through the church. I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't even talk about the church, this major culture shaping institution. And so I do think that we have to have a serious conversation. Like, there are other culture shaping institutions than the three I dealt with in the book, which were the university, the arts, and like the city, the church, right? And the church has got to be part of this. So the Benedict option is relevant in some way, like, because he does all this great stuff about the church just being the church and self-identifying in that way. So we do have to fit that in somewhere. That was the one miss. I just want to throw that out there. So I'm actually thinking of writing talking to a publisher about writing a sequel. I've actually got one sequel coming out in a year.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about. What are you working on?
Okay, yeah. Let me tell you. So in this book, the Cultural Apologetics book, I argued that we need to join with God to re-enchant the world in two ways. And I've already said them a few times tonight. Seeing and delighting in the world the same way Jesus does, and then inviting others to do the same. Those are two future book projects. The second one is for non-believers, helping them to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And I just finished writing that book. It's a book for non-believers where I take them on an imaginative, reasonable journey through 11 features of our world, trying to blend reason and imagination, argument and idea, image and idea. And I use this metaphor of 11 stones, like cairns, as you're journeying up a mountain, and the cairns guide you to the summit. We can kind of take them on this journey. So that's for non-believers, and that'll come out in a year. Super excited for that, but it's already at the publisher.
Wow.
But then I'm also talking about doing that other book, the one for believers, where we need to learn to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And I'm actually exploring writing that with a pastor to help incorporate, like, just as Christians, what does that mean? And what does that mean to be the church in these areas? So so I'm looking forward to developing those, in the near future.
That's awesome.
Yeah, we'll have to have you back on after those and after you've gone through all the more important interviews.
Oh no, anytime. Happy to get on with you guys. Yeah.
Well, sure. So to wrap up, you've mentioned a few books already, of course, besides yours. What are some books that Christians should be reading to really engage more with this and how to move forward?
Yeah. Man, there's so many books. I guess I would say in general, just become readers. All of us, there's so many good resources. If you're interested in beauty and art, there's so many good books that are out right now on beauty and art. There's a book that just came out by Julius Johnson, Baylor University prof, that looks phenomenal on beauty. You can just Google that and you'll find it, that I plan on reading as soon as I can find time. Read Lewis, read Tolkien, of course. In terms of apologetics, trying to think of some. There's a great book coming out by Gavin Ortland, who's a pastor. It's a book that's more imaginative, taking the arguments for God and framing it in terms of a narrative. And he's done a great job. And so that's coming out in October. I've got an advanced copy. It's really good. But just read where you're interested, right? There's great books on liturgy. Jamie K.A. Smith stuff, I think, is super important on liturgy. So I would become familiar with even his more popular You Are What You Love is a great book. There's so many. Sorry. Every year, I keep a book log. I'm one of those guys that, I don't know, just quirky in that way. And then every year in January, I write a blog with my best books read from the prior year. And I do it in 4 categories: best philosophy book, best apologetic theology book, best devotional book, and best fiction and best nonfiction. And so if you go look at my blog, that's basically how I'm doing on my blog there right now, is this once a year thing. But there you'll see all the best books that I would recommend for the last 8 years. So how about that?
That's okay. When we ask an academic what are the must-read books, it would be wrong of us to expect anything else but an answer like that.
That's a tough one.
Dr. Gould, we appreciate you joining us today. Man, this has been fun, and we'd love to have you back on some other time.
Yeah.
The whole reason why we started the Logosians was because we want people to be re-enchanted. We want their imaginations to be reawakened, and we think that Tolkien and Lewis are just 2 of those guys that have done it for a lot of us, and we think we want more people to be willing to read some of those things. So we appreciate you coming in here and joining with us, and really just reinforcing what we're trying to get people to be involved in.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're super thankful for the work that you do, and we will continue to follow it closely.
Yeah, is there anything else that you want to plug, your blog, or where to buy your books or anything like that?
Yeah, you can find all my stuff online. That's fine. I do have other creative outlets for these kinds of things. I have a podcast that I've been doing for the last couple of years called the Udo Podcast, and you can find that on another website that for some other stuff I do, called the 2 Tasks Institute. But we've got 5 seasons that Courtney, my co-host, and I have done. The last season that we just finished was on the search for meaning in a disenchanted world. But we have a season on the virtues and the vices. We have a season on art, imagination, and beauty. I'm thinking season 6 will be on Lewis and his space trilogy, but to be determined. But anyway, so you can check that out, and then just look for fall of 2022. This book, I'm not sure if the title, I think our publishers, they might change it, but for now it's tentatively entitled 11 Stones, but just look for that. And of course, check out Palm Beach Atlantic if you want to study this stuff in depth. You don't have to move. You could move, come down, join us in Florida. But for those of you who already have jobs, we have this option where you can do it. We call it a hybrid. So for anybody interested, just reach out to me over email or social media, and I'll be happy to jump on Zoom and chat with you more about that. So thank you guys. Yeah, you guys are doing important work. So glad to be a part of this.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, and that's it. And so we'll see you guys next time. And thanks again to Dr. Gould, and we'll see you on the next episode of Logosians Podcast.